Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you the most compelling tales of love, resilience, and redemption. In today's story, we step into the Grand Harrington estate, a place where wealth and privilege hide a web of secrets, betrayal, and unimaginable pain. Follow Evelyn, a compassionate nurse, as she uncovers a chilling conspiracy against Charlotte, a woman trapped in a nightmare orchestrated by her own family. This journey of courage, truth, and justice will leave you inspired and remind us all of the power of love and determination. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin this incredible tale today. The crisp Connecticut morning air carried a sense of foreboding as I approached the Harrington estate for the first time. The estate loomed ahead. A stately mansion with intricate stonework and manicured gardens that seemed at odds with the oppressive atmosphere it exuded. As a nurse with years of experience in hospice and critical care, I thought I had seen it all. But something about this assignment unsettled me. Perhaps it was the quiet urgency in the voice of the agency director when he explained the case, or the way he avoided eye contact as he handed me the details. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. When the wrought iron gates opened, the long driveway seemed endless, lined with towering oaks that cast elongated shadows in the early sunlight. I parked near the front steps and smoothed my crisp white uniform, a ritual that usually steadied my nerves. Not today. My heart raced as I rang the doorbell, the chime echoing ominously within. The door opened to reveal Grant Harrington. He was tall and imposing, with sharp features and an impeccable suit that gave him the air of authority. His smile was as polished as his appearance, but it didn't reach his piercing blue eyes. "Miss Scott, I presume?" His voice was smooth, almost too smooth, like the surface of a frozen lake. "Welcome to Harrington Estate. I trust you are prepared for the task ahead." "Yes, Mr. Harrington," I replied, forcing confidence into my tone. "I'm here to care for Mrs. Harrington." His expression didn't change, but there was something calculating in his gaze, as though he were sizing me up. "Good. Charlotte requires special attention. Follow me, and I'll introduce you to the household." As I stepped inside, the grandeur of the estate was almost suffocating. Marble floors gleamed under ornate chandeliers, and oil portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls. Yet beneath the luxury was a stifling silence, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Grant led me to the sitting room, where a woman in a maid's uniform was arranging a vase of fresh lilies. She was young and attractive, her auburn hair pulled into a neat bun. When she looked up, her brown eyes darted to Grant before dropping to the floor. "This is Sophia Turner," Grant said. "She manages the household. If you need anything, she'll assist you." Sophia nodded but said nothing. Her posture was tense, and I couldn't help but notice the brief, almost imperceptible glance she shared with Grant. It was fleeting, but it spoke volumes. There was something between them. "Pleasure to meet you," I said, offering a polite smile. Sophia's response was a quick nod before she returned to her task. As we moved deeper into the house, the sound of a cane tapping against the floor reached my ears. Turning a corner, I saw Evelyn Prescott. Though age had bent her posture, there was a fire in her sharp green eyes. She was impeccably dressed, her silver hair pinned back in an elegant twist. "Ah, Mrs. Prescott," Grant said, his tone carefully neutral. "I was just introducing Miss Scott to the household." Evelyn's gaze shifted to me, her stern expression softening. "Miss Scott, welcome," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "My daughter is fortunate to have you." "Thank you, Mrs. Prescott. I'll do my best to ensure she receives the care she needs." As Grant's phone buzzed and he excused himself, Evelyn leaned in close. Her voice dropped to a whisper, her words so quiet that I had to strain to hear. "You seem like a good woman, Miss Scott. Keep your eyes open in this house. Not everyone here has your patient's best interests at heart." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I met her gaze. And what I saw, there was a mixture of fear and determination. She was trying to warn me. But of what? Before I could ask, she straightened and gave me a pointed look that seemed to say, "Not now." Moments later, Grant returned, his polished demeanor intact. Finally, I was led to Charlotte Harrington's room. Grant opened the door with a reverence that bordered on theatrical. "Here she is," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, or at least an imitation of it. The room was opulent yet strangely cold. Heavy drapes blocked out most of the sunlight, casting the space in a dim, almost ethereal light. Charlotte lay motionless on an elaborate four-poster bed, her pale skin contrasting sharply with her raven-black hair, which fanned out across the pillow like ink spilled on snow. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and her closed eyes gave her an almost serene appearance. "She's been like this since the accident," Grant said, his voice breaking slightly. "She needs constant care. I trust you're up to the task." "Yes, of course," I replied, my nurse's instincts overriding my unease. Approaching the bed, I began to assess her condition, noting the atrophied muscles and coolness of her skin, signs of long-term immobility. My heart ached at the sight. Whatever had happened to her, it was clear she had been neglected for far too long. After Grant left, I spent the next few hours familiarizing myself with Charlotte's care regimen, or rather, the lack of it. The medical equipment was outdated, and the medication list raised red flags. Several vials were unmarked, and the doses seemed excessive for someone in her condition. My unease grew with every discovery. Later that evening, as I sat by Charlotte's bedside, Evelyn appeared in the doorway. She stepped inside, her cane tapping softly against the floor. "How is she?" Evelyn asked, her voice heavy with emotion. "She's stable, but her care has been questionable," I said carefully. "I have concerns about the medications she's been given." Evelyn's eyes darkened, and she placed a trembling hand on Charlotte's. "My poor Charlotte," she whispered. "I knew something was wrong. But Grant, he won't let me intervene. He controls everything." Her words confirmed what I had begun to suspect: there was more to Charlotte's condition than met the eye. "Mrs. Prescott," I said gently, "is there something I should know? Anything that could help me care for her?" Evelyn hesitated, her eyes flicking to the door as though expecting Grant to appear. Finally, she leaned in, her voice trembling with both anger and sorrow. "Grant married my daughter for her money. He's been controlling her for years. And now this accident." She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't believe it was an accident at all." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I looked at Charlotte, so fragile and vulnerable, and made a silent vow. Whatever was happening in this house, I would uncover the truth. The next morning, the Harrington estate seemed even more oppressive. The sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds, and the air was thick with unease. As I made my way to Charlotte's room, Evelyn's whispered warnings echoed in my mind, refusing to let me rest. Her fear was palpable, her words carrying the weight of untold truths. What was Grant hiding? When I entered Charlotte's room, she looked as fragile as ever. Her pallor reminded me of porcelain, delicate and cold to the touch. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a faint twitch in her fingers. It was so subtle that it might have been mistaken for a trick of the light. But my instincts told me otherwise. Could it be that Charlotte was trying to communicate? "Charlotte," I murmured softly, crouching beside her bed. "Can you hear me?" There was no response. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was present, trapped inside a body that refused to cooperate. I gently took her hand, her skin cool beneath my fingers. "I'm here to help you," I whispered. "You're not alone." After finishing my routine checks, I decided to inspect the medication cabinet again. The vials of unmarked substances gnawed at my conscience. Who prescribed these? What were they meant to do? The dosage seemed unnecessarily high for someone in Charlotte's condition. As I carefully examined the bottles, the door creaked open, startling me. I turned to see Sophia standing there, her expression unreadable. "Miss Scott," she said, her voice low. "May I have a word?" I nodded, setting the vials aside. Sophia entered the room, her footsteps barely audible on the thick carpet. She glanced at Charlotte, her eyes softening for a moment before returning to me. "I noticed you've been asking questions," she began hesitantly, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her apron. "About the medication. About Mrs. Harrington's condition." "Yes," I admitted. "Something doesn't feel right. The dosages. The unmarked bottles, none of it makes sense." Sophia's gaze darted to the door before she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not wrong. But be careful. Mr. Harrington doesn't like anyone poking around." Her warning sent a chill down my spine. But I pressed on. "Do you know what's going on, Sophia? Is someone tampering with her care?" Sophia hesitated, her lips parting as though she was about to speak. But then she stopped herself. She shook her head, her expression conflicted. "I can't say," she whispered. "But if you want to help her, watch the nighttime routines. That's when things happen." "What things?" I asked urgently, but Sophia had already straightened and stepped back, retreating toward the door. "Just be careful," she said, her voice almost trembling. "For your own sake." She left before I could ask more, leaving me with a gnawing sense of dread. What was she afraid of? And what was happening at night? That evening, I decided to stay by Charlotte's bedside longer than usual. The house grew quieter with every passing hour, the sounds of the staff finishing their duties fading into the oppressive silence of the night. I sat in the dimly lit room, my heart pounding as I waited. Around midnight, I heard the faintest sound of footsteps outside the door. My pulse quickened as I rose from my chair and crept toward the shadows of the room, careful to stay hidden. The door opened slowly, and Grant entered, carrying a small bag. His movements were deliberate, his expression unreadable as he approached Charlotte's bed. I watched from the corner, barely breathing, as he retrieved a syringe from the bag. My stomach churned as I realized what he was about to do. He filled the syringe with one of the unmarked vials, the liquid glinting faintly in the dim light. Then, with clinical precision, he injected it into Charlotte's foreline. "Sleep tight, my love," he murmured, his voice disturbingly tender. I clenched my fists, every fiber of my being screaming at me to intervene. But I knew I had no proof yet. I needed more than suspicion to confront him. My heart ached as I watched Charlotte's already motionless body seem to grow even more still. When Grant finally left the room, I waited several agonizing minutes before emerging from the shadows. I rushed to the foreline, my hands trembling as I inspected it. The faintest trace of the liquid lingered in the tubing. Whatever he had administered, it wasn't part of the standard regimen. The next morning, I met Evelyn in the garden, where she often spent her mornings tending to the flowers. Her cane rested beside her as she worked diligently, her presence a rare source of warmth in the otherwise cold estate. "Mrs. Prescott," I began cautiously, "I saw something last night. Grant, he gave Charlotte something. A medication that wasn't prescribed. Do you know anything about this?" Evelyn froze, her hand hovering over a rose bush. When she turned to me, her expression was both anguished and resolute. "I knew it," she said softly. "He's keeping her that way on purpose." "What do you mean?" I pressed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Charlotte didn't fall into that coma naturally," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "It started after the accident." "Yes. But she was recovering. And then, Grant insisted on taking over her care. He brought in his own doctors, his own medications. After that, she stopped improving." Her words confirmed my worst fears. I looked back toward the house, where Grant's shadowy figure stood by the window, watching us. The weight of the truth settled heavily on my shoulders. I couldn't turn back now. Whatever the risks. I was determined to uncover the full extent of what Grant was doing and to save Charlotte from the prison he had created for her. The days that followed were a blur of vigilance and careful planning. Every moment in the Harrington estate felt like a dance on a razor's edge. Where one misstep could expose me. The weight of what I had seen and the knowledge of what was happening to Charlotte gnawed at my soul. I knew I had to act. But recklessness would only put both of us in greater danger. My thoughts often wandered to Evelyn. Her whispered warnings and the anguish in her eyes haunted me. She had known all along. But her frailty, both physical and in her position within the household, had kept her from taking any action. She trusted me, a stranger, to bring light to the dark shadows that plagued the Harrington family. One evening, I found Evelyn alone in the library. The warm, golden light from the setting sun cast a soft glow on the leather-bound books lining the shelves. She sat in a high-backed chair, her hands clasped tightly on her lap, as though she were trying to anchor herself against an unseen storm. "Mrs. Prescott," I said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, and her weary eyes met mine. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, taking a seat across from her. I saw Grant administering something to Charlotte. It wasn't part of her prescribed treatment. Whatever it was, it's keeping her in that state. Why would he do this? Evelyn sighed heavily, her frail frame seeming to collapse under the weight of her emotions. "Grant's motives are as cold as they are cruel," she began. "Charlotte's fortune, he gains full control as long as she remains incapacitated. And if she were to," she stopped herself, her voice breaking. I didn't need her to finish. The implications were clear, and they sent a chill down my spine. Grant wasn't just content with Charlotte being trapped in her coma, he had no intention of letting her wake. "Why hasn't anyone spoken out?" I asked, though I suspected the answer. "Fear," Evelyn said, her tone sharp with bitterness. "Grant is powerful, influential. Everyone in this house is either complicit or too scared to act. Sophia, the maid, she knows more than she lets on. But she's terrified of losing her job, her livelihood. As for me, I'm just an old woman with no proof and no power. You have me," I said, gripping her hand gently. "We can do this together." Evelyn's hand trembled in mine, but she nodded. "If you're truly willing, we must act soon. But tread carefully, my dear. Grant won't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatens his plans." That night, I decided to take a risk. I returned to Charlotte's room after everyone had retired to their quarters. The house was cloaked in silence, save for the soft creaks and groans of the old structure settling into the night. My pulse thundered in my ears as I approached Charlotte's bedside. She lay as still as ever, her delicate features illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the curtains. I gently took her hand, holding it in both of mine. "Charlotte," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. "If you can hear me, I need you to try and give me a sign. Anything. I'm here to help you. But I need to know you're still fighting." For a moment, there was nothing but the soft hum of the medical equipment and the distant sound of the wind rustling the trees outside. And then, just as I was about to give up, I felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible squeeze of her fingers around mine. Tears welled in my eyes as I whispered, "You're still here. You're still fighting." I didn't want to overwhelm her, so I kept my words brief, promising her that I wouldn't stop until I had uncovered the truth and set her free. As I left the room, a renewed sense of determination filled me. The next day, I decided to confront Sophia. She was in the kitchen, scrubbing a cast-iron skillet with a ferocity that suggested she was trying to work out more than just a stubborn stain. When she saw me, her eyes darted nervously to the doorway, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "Miss Scott," I said, keeping my voice low, "we need to talk. It's about Charlotte." Sophia froze, her grip tightening on the handle of the skillet. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said hastily, but her trembling hands betrayed her. "I know you do." I pressed gently. "I saw you exchange a glance with Grant the first day I arrived. You know something. Sophia. Please. If you care about Charlotte at all, help me." Her shoulders slumped as the fight drained out of her. She set the skillet down and turned to face me, her expression a mixture of fear and guilt. "What do you want to know?" she asked quietly. "Everything," I replied. And so, she told me about how Grant had started bringing in the unmarked medications shortly after the accident, how he had instructed the staff to stay silent and not question his orders, how he had threatened Sophia with dismissal and financial ruin if she ever spoke a word of what she had seen. "But why?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Sophia's voice cracked as she said, "He doesn't want her to recover. As long as Charlotte's like this, he controls everything, the estate, the finances, the power. And if she were to pass away, he'd inherit it all." My stomach turned, but I refused to let my horror show. I needed Sophia to keep talking. "Will you help me stop him?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. She hesitated, glancing toward the doorway again. I don't know. He's dangerous. If he finds out." "He won't," I assured her. "Not if we're careful. But I can't do this alone." Sophia's eyes searched mine, and after a long moment, she nodded. "All right. I'll help you. But please, be careful." As I left the kitchen, I knew the stakes had just been raised. I now had an ally but also an even greater reason to succeed. Grant's hold over the Harrington estate was tightening. But so was my resolve. Charlotte's faint squeeze of my hand had reignited a fire within me, and I was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The following days unfolded with a sense of grim determination. With Sophia's reluctant agreement to help, I felt a glimmer of hope. But it was fragile, like a candle flickering in a cold wind. Every moment spent in the Harrington estate felt charged with tension, as if the house itself was aware of our plans. Grant's looming presence was a constant shadow, and his sharp eyes seemed to pierce through every layer of pretense. Evelyn's warnings echoed in my mind. "He's powerful. You must tread carefully, my dear." Those words were my anchor, reminding me to keep my emotions and actions in check. Late one night, Sophia and I met in the laundry room, a quiet corner of the mansion far from prying eyes and ears. The rhythmic hum of the washer provided a comforting background noise as we exchanged whispers. "I've seen where he keeps the vials," Sophia said, her voice low and trembling. "There's a locked cabinet in his study. I've watched him go in and out late at night." "That's it," I replied, my voice firm despite the apprehension rising in my chest. "That's where he's hiding them." Sophia wrung her hands, glancing nervously at the door. "What if he catches us? You don't know what he's capable of. He's not the man he pretends to be." "I know," I said softly, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "But this is the only way. We need proof. Sophia, something concrete to expose him. Charlotte's life depends on it." Sophia nodded, though her reluctance was clear. "I'll help you. But we have to be quick. If he finds out." "He won't," I promised, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The plan was set. Sophia would distract Grant under the pretense of needing his approval for some household matter, giving me enough time to slip into his study and search the cabinet. It was a risky move, but the stakes were too high to let fear hold us back. The night of our plan, I felt the weight of every step as I crept toward the study. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft rustle of the wind against the windows. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the heavy oak door. I tested the handle, relieved to find it unlocked. Grant must not have anticipated anyone daring to enter his private domain. Slipping inside, I closed the door quietly behind me and took in the room. It was as imposing as the man himself, dark wood paneling, towering shelves lined with leather-bound books, and an ornate desk that seemed more like a throne than a piece of furniture. The cabinet Sophia had described stood against the far wall, its metal surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. I crossed the room swiftly, my hands trembling as I tried the handle. Locked. Of course. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the small lock-picking kit I had brought with me. It wasn't a skill I had ever expected to need, but necessity had a way of sharpening unexpected talents. With shaking hands, I inserted the pick into the lock and worked quickly, my breath hitching every time I heard a distant sound. After what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked open. I exhaled a shaky breath and pulled the cabinet door ajar. Inside, rows of unmarked vials glinted in the faint light. My stomach churned at the sight. This was it, the evidence we needed. I took a few of the vials, tucking them carefully into the lining of my nurse's bag. My hands brushed against a folder tucked behind the vials. Curiosity burned within me, and I pulled it out. Flipping it open, I found medical records and financial documents, proof of Grant's cruel manipulations and his motive to control Charlotte's fortune. The sound of footsteps approaching the study sent a jolt of fear through me. I shoved the folder back into the cabinet and closed the door quietly, retreating to the far side of the room. My heart raced as the footsteps grew louder. The handle turned, and the door creaked open. Grant stepped inside, his imposing figure silhouetted against the light from the hallway. He paused, his sharp eyes scanning the room. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall and praying that the shadows concealed me. After a moment, he turned toward the desk, seemingly satisfied that he was alone. My mind raced. I couldn't risk staying any longer, but slipping out unnoticed seemed impossible. Just as Grant moved to sit at his desk, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. Sophia's distraction, her timing was impeccable. Grant's head snapped up, his expression darkening as he strode out of the study. I waited a few heartbeats before slipping out, my pulse thundering in my ears. Clutching my bag tightly, I made my way back to my quarters, my mind racing with everything I had just uncovered. When I reached my room, I locked the door and sat down at the small desk, pulling out the vials and examining them closely. Their contents were a mystery, but I was determined to have them analyzed. The folder's absence gnawed at me, but the vials were a start, a vital piece of the puzzle. The next morning, I called a trusted friend, a lab technician named David who owed me a favor. "I need your help," I told him. "It's urgent." David agreed without hesitation, promising to keep the matter discreet. I arranged to meet him the following day, the vials safely concealed in my bag. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But the danger was far from over. Grant was cunning and ruthless, and I knew he wouldn't rest until he had uncovered the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I thought of Charlotte. Her faint squeeze of my hand, her silent plea for help, filled me with resolve. Whatever it took, I would see this through. No matter the cost, justice would prevail. The following morning, I awoke to a heavy sense of foreboding. The vials hidden in my bag were a constant reminder of the danger lurking within the walls of the Harrington estate. As I prepared for the day, my mind raced through the events of the previous night, replaying the sound of the lock clicking open, the sight of the damning vials, and the weight of Grant's presence in the study. Sophia approached me during breakfast, her eyes darting around the room to ensure no one else was listening. "Did you find anything?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clinking of silverware and the hum of muted conversation. I nodded subtly, keeping my expression neutral. "I did. But we'll need to act carefully. The evidence is strong, but it's not enough on its own. I've arranged for an analysis of the vials. Once we know what's inside, we'll have a clearer picture." Sophia's face paled. "You took them out of the house?" What if he finds out? He won't, I replied firmly, though I wasn't as confident as I sounded. We don't have a choice, Sophia. Charlotte's life is at stake. As the day unfolded, the tension in the house grew thicker. Grant's gaze seemed to linger on me longer than usual, his sharp eyes narrowing as if he suspected something. I kept my composure, focusing on my duties and avoiding his scrutiny as much as possible. My only solace came from the moments I spent with Charlotte, her fragile hand resting in mine as I whispered reassurances she couldn't respond to but, I hoped, could still hear. That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, I slipped out of the estate under the pretense of running errands. My heart pounded as I walked briskly down the street, clutching my bag tightly. The world outside felt alien, as if the weight of the Harrington estate's secrets had followed me beyond its gates. David's lab was tucked away in a quiet industrial area, the hum of machinery and the faint smell of chemicals filling the air as I entered. David greeted me with a warm smile, though his curiosity was evident as he gestured for me to sit. All right, Nora, he said, settling into his chair and folding his arms. What's so urgent that you needed me to drop everything? I placed the vials on the table between us, their contents glinting under the fluorescent lights. I need you to analyze these, I said, my voice low but firm. I need to know exactly what's inside, and I need you to keep this between us. David's brows furrowed as he picked up one of the vials, turning it over in his hands. Unmarked, he murmured. This isn't the usual over-the-counter stuff. Where did you get these? I can't say, I replied, meeting his gaze. But it's a matter of life and death. David, please. He studied me for a moment before nodding. All right. I'll see what I can do. But it might take a day or two to get results. That's fine, I said, though the idea of waiting filled me with unease. Just, be careful. And let me know as soon as you find anything. I left the lab feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. The first step had been taken, but the path ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty. My return to the estate was uneventful, but the oppressive atmosphere inside the house was impossible to ignore. Grant's presence loomed like a storm cloud, and every interaction with him felt like a game of chess, each word and gesture calculated, every move carrying the potential for disaster. That evening, as I checked on Charlotte, I found myself speaking to her as if she could respond. We're getting closer, I whispered, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. Soon, we'll have the proof we need. And then you'll be free. Her stillness was heart-wrenching, but I thought I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a faint glimmer of awareness that gave me hope. As I left Charlotte's room, I nearly collided with Grant in the hallway. His imposing figure blocked my path, and his piercing gaze sent a shiver down my spine. Miss Bennet, he said smoothly, his voice laced with suspicion. You've been rather preoccupied lately. Is everything all right? I forced a polite smile, though my heart was racing. Of course, Mr. Harrington. Just focused on ensuring Mrs. Harrington's care is the best it can be. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Good. I'd hate to think there was anything distracting you from your duties. His words hung in the air like a threat, and I nodded before stepping past him, my legs trembling with the effort to appear calm. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the weight of the day settled over me. The evidence was out of the house, but I was no closer to knowing the full extent of Grant's actions. The danger felt more tangible than ever, and every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. But as I drifted off to sleep, one thought remained clear: I wouldn't give up. For Charlotte. For Evelyn. For the truth, I would see this through to the end. The next morning arrived with an ominous stillness that seemed to hang over the Harrington estate like a dark cloud. As I walked through the grand hallways, the faint echoes of my footsteps felt unnervingly loud in the silence. Grant was nowhere to be seen, and Sophia's anxious glances told me she shared my unease. I decided to visit Charlotte early. hoping for even the smallest sign of change. As I entered her room, I noticed the faintest movement of her fingers, a subtle twitch that sent a surge of hope through me. Kneeling beside her bed, I gently took her hand. "Charlotte," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. "If you can hear me, try to move your fingers again." For a moment, nothing happened. I held my breath, willing her to respond. Then, with almost agonizing slowness, her fingers moved once more. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. She was fighting, trying to reach out from the depths of her silence. Tears pricked my eyes as I leaned closer. "You're not alone anymore," I murmured. "I'm going to help you. I promise." The moment was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Quickly, I straightened up and began rearranging the medical supplies on the table. Trying to appear composed, the door opened, and Grant entered, his sharp eyes sweeping the room before settling on me. "Miss Bennet," he said smoothly, though his tone carried an edge. "How is my wife this morning?" I turned to face him, forcing a professional smile. "She seems stable, Mr. Harrington. No significant changes." His gaze lingered on me for a moment too long, and I could feel the weight of his scrutiny. "Good," he finally said, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe me. "I trust you're keeping a close eye on her." "Of course," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Her care is my top priority." Grant nodded but didn't leave. Instead, he walked to the bedside and looked down at Charlotte, his expression unreadable. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of something resembling guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "She's always been so delicate," he said softly, almost to himself. "Fragile. Like glass." His words sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that his sentiment was anything but genuine. There was something sinister in the way he spoke, as if he reveled in her vulnerability. After a moment, he turned back to me. "You've been very dedicated, Miss Bennet," he said, his voice regaining its calculated edge. "But remember, you're here to follow my instructions. Nothing more." "Of course, Mr. Harrington," I replied, my heart pounding. With one last lingering look at Charlotte, he left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. I released a shaky breath, the tension in my body slowly easing. It was becoming increasingly clear that Grant was watching me closely, waiting for me to slip up. But I couldn't let him intimidate me. Charlotte's survival depended on my resolve. Later that afternoon, I received a call from David. The results of the analysis were ready. His voice was tense, and I could hear the weight of the findings in every word. "Nora, we need to talk," he said. "Can you meet me at the lab?" "Of course," I replied, already planning my excuse to leave the estate. "I'll be there as soon as I can." As I hung up the phone, I felt a surge of both dread and determination. Whatever David had discovered, I knew it would confirm my worst fears. But it was also the key to exposing the truth and saving Charlotte. I informed Sophia of my plans, asking her to keep an eye on Charlotte while I was away. She hesitated, worry etched on her face. "Nora, be careful," she said. "If Grant finds out." "He won't," I assured her, though I wasn't entirely confident. "I'll be back soon." The journey to David's lab felt like an eternity, every turn of the road bringing me closer to the answers I had been seeking and the danger they carried. When I arrived, David was waiting for me, his expression grave. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Nora, this is worse than we thought," he said, handing me the report. My hands trembled as I read through the findings. The vials contained a powerful sedative, far beyond what was necessary for someone in Charlotte's condition. The doses were increasing, enough to suggest a deliberate effort to keep her incapacitated or worse. "This isn't just neglect," David said, his voice low. "This is intentional. If the dosages continued, it could have been fatal." I felt the blood drain from my face. Grant wasn't just keeping Charlotte in a vegetative state, he was slowly killing her. The realization hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless with anger and fear. "Thank you, David," I managed to say, clutching the report. "This is exactly what I needed." He placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Be careful, Nora. If Harrington finds out you have this, he won't take it lightly." "I know," I said, my voice firm despite the knot of fear in my chest. "But I can't stop now. Charlotte needs me." As I left the lab, the weight of the evidence in my hands felt both empowering and terrifying. The truth was within my grasp, but so was the danger that came with it. Returning to the estate, I knew I was walking into a lion's den, but there was no turning back now. That evening, as I sat by Charlotte's bedside, I silently vowed to her that I would see this through. No matter the cost, I would expose Grant's lies and save her from the nightmare he had created. Together, we would fight for her freedom and her life. The following morning arrived with an uneasy quiet. The Harrington estate, usually bustling with the muted sounds of its daily routines, felt unnaturally still. As I stepped into Charlotte's room, a sense of foreboding settled in my chest. She lay as she always did, her fragile body almost swallowed by the soft folds of her bedding. But her fingers, faintly twitching beneath the sheets, reminded me that she was fighting her silent battle. I leaned down, whispering softly, "Charlotte, we're closer now. I have the proof. We're going to end this." Her fingers stilled, but I imagined the strength she must have felt to hear those words. Carefully, I tucked the medical report into my bag, knowing it was both my shield and my sword. The moment of reckoning was drawing near, and I needed to be ready. As I prepared to leave the room, a soft knock startled me. Sophia peeked in, her face pale and anxious. "Nora," she whispered, stepping inside and glancing nervously behind her. "Something isn't right. Grant's been in his study all morning, making calls. He's tense, more than usual." "What kind of calls?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. She shook her head. "I couldn't hear much, but he mentioned a new arrangement and seemed frantic." My mind raced. Grant must have realized that I was onto him. The pressure was mounting, and his actions were becoming more erratic. I couldn't afford to wait any longer. I needed to act. "Sophia," I said, grabbing her hands, "I need you to trust me. Whatever happens today, stay close to Charlotte. Protect her." Her eyes widened in fear, but she nodded. "I will. Just be careful, Nora." With that, I left the room, my pulse quickening as I made my way to Grant's study. The heavy oak door loomed ahead of me, its polished surface reflecting the dim light of the corridor. I hesitated for a moment, gathering my courage, before knocking firmly. "Come in," came Grant's sharp voice. I pushed the door open, stepping inside to find him seated at his desk, his piercing eyes narrowing as they met mine. Papers were strewn across the desk, and his phone lay discarded to the side. "Miss Bennet," he said coolly, leaning back in his chair, "to what do I owe this unannounced visit?" I took a deep breath, the weight of my decision pressing heavily on me. "Mr. Harrington, we need to talk. It's about Charlotte." His expression didn't falter, but a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, flashed in his eyes. "What about my wife?" I stepped closer, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. "I know what you've been doing, Grant. The sedatives, the falsified care, the lies. I know everything." For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with tension. Then, Grant laughed, a low, hollow sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Miss Bennet," he said, rising from his chair, "you have quite the imagination. What exactly are you accusing me of?" I reached into my bag, pulling out the report and placing it firmly on his desk. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Grant. The evidence speaks for itself." He picked up the report, his face unreadable as he scanned its contents. Slowly, he set it down, his gaze locking onto mine with a cold intensity. "And what do you plan to do with this?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "I plan to take it to the authorities," I replied, my voice unwavering. "Charlotte deserves justice. And you deserve to face the consequences of your actions." Grant's expression darkened, and he took a step closer, his imposing presence filling the room. "You think you can waltz in here, accuse me of such vile things, and walk out unscathed? Do you know who you're dealing with, Miss Bennet?" "I do," I said, refusing to back down. "A man who has manipulated and betrayed the very people who trusted him. But your power won't protect you this time, Grant." His lips curled into a menacing smile. "You're making a grave mistake. I could ruin you, destroy your career, your reputation. You'd be nothing. And yet," I said, stepping forward, "here I stand." The tension in the room was electric, a battle of wills playing out in the silence. Finally, Grant's composure cracked. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm with a grip that made me wince. "You think you've won, don't you?" he hissed, his face inches from mine. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Before I could respond, the door burst open, and Sophia appeared, her face pale but determined. "Let her go, Grant," she demanded, her voice trembling but strong. Grant froze, his grip loosening as he turned to face her. "Stay out of this, Sophia. You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," she said, stepping forward. "I've seen how you treat Charlotte, how you treat everyone in this house. Your time is up." Grant released me, his expression shifting to one of cold calculation. "You think you can take me down? Both of you? You're fools. We're not alone," I said, pulling my arm free and straightening my posture. "The truth is out, Grant. It's only a matter of time before justice catches up with you." He sneered, his confidence faltering for the first time. "You have no idea what you've started." "Maybe not," I said, meeting his gaze with defiance. "But I know how it ends." Grant's jaw tightened, and without another word, he stormed past us, leaving the study in a fury. Sophia turned to me, her eyes wide with fear and resolve. "What now?" she asked. I picked up the report, holding it tightly. "Now, we finish this." The storm was about to break, and I was ready to face it head on. For Charlotte. For the truth. For justice. The afternoon air outside the Harrington estate was heavy, laden with an eerie quiet that only heightened the storm brewing inside. Grant's fury lingered in the hallways like a tangible force. But I pushed it aside. The next steps were clear, even if they were perilous. With the report in hand, I hurried to the guest quarters where Charlotte's mother, Evelyn Sterling, had been staying. She had arrived unannounced 2 days prior, her sharp intuition telling her something was amiss. Despite Grant's attempts to downplay her concerns, Evelyn had stayed, her presence a quiet defiance. When I knocked on her door, she opened it quickly, her piercing green eyes scanning my face. "Nora," she said, her voice low but firm. "What's going on?" I saw Grant storming down the hallway like a man possessed. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. "Evelyn," I began, my tone serious. "It's time you know the truth about what's been happening to Charlotte." Her expression hardened, a mix of dread and determination settling on her features. "I've suspected something for months. Grant has kept me at arm's length, refused updates, and dodged my questions." "What are you saying?" I placed the report on the small table between us. "This is evidence that Charlotte has been deliberately kept in her vegetative state. The medications Grant has been giving her." My voice caught for a moment, the enormity of it pressing down on me. "They weren't meant to help her. They were sedatives and worse, increasing in potency to ensure she never recovered." Evelyn's face paled as she sank into the nearest chair. "My God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. He's been keeping her imprisoned in her own body. For what purpose? To control her. I replied softly. Her inheritance. Her autonomy. Everything she worked for. Her shock turned swiftly to anger. And her hand slammed against the table. That bastard. How dare he do this to her? To my daughter. We have to act now, I said urgently. I've confronted him. He knows the walls are closing in. And he's desperate. If we don't involve the authorities immediately, he could escalate. Evelyn stood, her resolve clear in her eyes. I'll call my attorney and the police. He won't get away with this. Before she could pick up the phone, a commotion echoed from the lower floors. A loud crash followed by raised voices reached us. And Evelyn and I exchanged a glance. Something was happening. We moved quickly, leaving the room and heading toward the source of the noise. As we descended the grand staircase, the sight that greeted us froze me in my tracks. Grant stood in the center of the foyer, flanked by two imposing men I didn't recognize. His expression was one of cold fury, but his eyes were wild, betraying his desperation. "You think you can take me down?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the grand space. His gaze landed on me, and he pointed a shaking finger. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Nora." "Grant. This is over," I said, stepping forward despite the pounding of my heart. "You've been exposed. The authorities will be here any minute." He laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. "Authorities? Do you think they'll believe you over me? I'm Grant Harrington. For God's sake." Evelyn's voice cut through his bluster like a blade. "And I'm Evelyn Sterling," she said, descending the stairs with all the poise of a queen. "A mother who will stop at nothing to protect her daughter. Your power ends here, Grant." The sight of her seemed to rattle him. His sneer faltered. And for a moment, a flicker of fear crossed his face. But then he straightened, his arrogance returning. "Do you think you can stop me with your threats? I have allies. Resources you can't imagine." "Not anymore," Evelyn countered, her voice calm but resolute. "I've already called my legal team. Everything you've built on lies is about to crumble." As if on cue, the sound of police sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. Grant's composure cracked completely, and he turned to his men. "Take care of this," he barked. "Now." The two men moved toward us, their intentions clear. But before they could act, a squad of police officers burst through the front doors, their weapons drawn. "Freeze," one of them commanded. "Hands where we can see them." The room erupted into chaos. Grant shouted protests as the officers restrained him, and his hired thugs were subdued in seconds. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat as the scene unfolded. It was over. Finally. It was over. Evelyn placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Nora," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "You saved her." I glanced up the staircase to where Sophia stood, watching with tears streaming down her face. She nodded at me, her expression a mixture of relief and admiration. I knew there was still much to face, the legal battles, the emotional scars, but in that moment, a weight lifted from my chest. As the officers led Grant away, his eyes locked onto mine, filled with venom. "This isn't over," he spat. "You'll regret this." I met his gaze, unflinching. "No, Grant," I said firmly. "You will." With that, the door closed behind him, and a heavy silence fell over the house. For the first time in years, it felt like the Harrington estate could finally breathe again. The storm had broken, and the light was beginning to shine through. As the sun set over the sprawling Harrington estate, a sense of peace finally settled. Evelyn sat beside Charlotte, holding her hand, their bond stronger than ever after the storm they had weathered. Nora stood quietly in the corner, a small smile on her face. watching the mother and daughter reunite in a moment of healing. The house, once filled with secrets and shadows, now held the promise of new beginnings. Grant Harrington's departure marked not just an end, but a transformation, a chance for Charlotte to reclaim her life and rebuild the future she had been robbed of. "This is just the beginning," Charlotte said softly, her voice carrying a strength that had been buried for far too long. "For us. For justice. And for others who might still be trapped like I was." Nora nodded, her heart swelling with pride and hope. Together, they had turned the tide of injustice into a wave of empowerment. And so, as the stars emerged one by one, the Harrington family began to write their new chapter, one of love, resilience, and hope. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales. Stay tuned for the next chapter of Extraordinary Journeys, coming soon.